Welcome to the Indiana Century Podcast, hosted by Corey Easterday. Episode 13, From Tennessee Valley to Indiana Century. Part 1, The Land That Was Left Behind. Before the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Tennessee Valley was one of the poorest regions in America. The land was eroded, the soil was depleted. Floods came every spring and washed away whatever the farmers had managed to plant. Malaria was rampant. Only 3% of farms even had electricity. The people who lived there had been left behind. They were told the same things that we're told today. There's no hope. The best you can do is manage your decline. The smart people will end up leaving. The ones who stay will scrape by. Then, in 1933, the federal government did something remarkable. It created the Tennessee Valley Authority, a public corporation, a state-owned utility, but at a regional scale. The TVA built dams, it generated electricity, it controlled floods, it manufactured fertilizer, it taught farmers how to restore their soil. It brought the first lights to 1 million homes. The TVA didn't just build infrastructure, it built an entire region. It proved that ordinary people, organized at scale, could lift themselves out of poverty. It proved that public ownership could work. It proved that big things were possible. Today, in episode 13, we look backward before we look forward. We study the TVA. What worked, what didn't, what we can learn from the largest public works project in American history. Because the Indiana Century Project is not without precedent. We have done this before, and we can do it again. Part 2, The Problem the TVA Solved. Let me paint a picture of the Tennessee Valley in 1933. The Tennessee River flooded every year. The floods destroyed crops, drowned livestock, washed away the topsoil. The soil that remained was exhausted. Farmers had planted cotton and tobacco for generations without rotating crops or restoring nutrients. The land couldn't produce anymore. Malaria was endemic. The mosquitoes that carried it bred in the stagnant water left behind by the floods. People were sick all the time. Children died young. Adults couldn't work at full capacity. Only 3% of farms at the time had electricity. 10% had running water. Most people lived in isolation, connected to nothing, with no way to get goods to market or information from the outside world. The federal government had tried private solutions. They hadn't worked. Private utilities wouldn't build power lines into the Tennessee Valley because the customers were too poor and too spread out. Private banks wouldn't lend for flood control because the return on investment was too uncertain. The market had decided that the people of the Tennessee Valley didn't matter. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? The TVA was the answer. A public corporation, owned by the federal government, but operated like a business. It had its own board, its own revenue, its own authority to build and operate. It wasn't a relief program or a handout. It was a builder. The parallels to Indiana are striking. We have abandoned parts of our state too. Rural counties where hospitals have closed, where young people leave, where the land is still productive, but the people extracting the value live somewhere else. The market has decided that those counties don't matter either. The TVA was built by an earlier generation that refused to accept that answer. Part 3, The TVA's Core Achievements. Let's walk through what the TVA actually built. Dams and flood control. The TVA built a system of dams across the Tennessee River watershed. They controlled flooding. They generated hydroelectric power. They created a navigable waterway that connected the region to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. The floods that had destroyed farms for generations stopped. They built electricity for everyone. The TVA didn't just build power plants, it built transmission lines, distribution networks. It brought electricity to places that private utilities had refused to serve. Farmers got lights, homes got refrigeration, schools got heat, hospitals got modern equipment. The difference between 3% electrification and 90% electrification is not incremental, it is transformational. Next, they worked on fertilizer and soil restoration. The TVA manufactured fertilizer at Muscle Shoals, Alabama. It taught farmers how to use it. It demonstrated crop rotation, contour plowing, and other regenerative practices. The soil that had been exhausted for generations recovered. Yields increased. Farmers became productive again. The TVA worked on economic development. They didn't just stop at infrastructure. They recruited industry. It helped communities plan their growth. It provided loans and technical assistance. Between 1933 and 1940, per capita income in the Tennessee Valley increased by almost 200%. People who had been subsistence farmers became factory workers, electricians, mechanics, engineers. The TVA also worked on public health. With the dams came mosquito control. Malaria rates plummeted. With electricity came refrigeration, which meant food stayed fresh longer. With economic development came better nutrition, better housing, better access to doctors. Life expectancy in the Tennessee Valley rose faster than the national average. The TVA was not just a power company. It was a regional transformation engine. It integrated energy, agriculture, infrastructure, and economic development decades before anyone used the word integration. Part 4. What the TVA got wrong. The TVA was not perfect. We need to learn from its failures as much as its successes. Displacement of people was an issue. The TVA built dams. The dams created reservoirs. The reservoirs flooded land. That land was home to thousands of families. The TVA bought their land. They paid them for it. But money doesn't replace a 100-year-old family farm. It doesn't replace a community cemetery. It doesn't replace the sense of place that comes from 5 generations living on that same soil. The TVA could have done more to support displaced families. It could have offered better relocation assistance. It could have helped them buy new land. It could have recognized that what was being taken was more than just real estate. We need to remember that lesson as we build our infrastructure corridors. The Infrastructure Corridors Amendment requires 125% compensation and relocation assistance for a reason. The TVA had an environmental cost. The TVA's dams changed the Tennessee River forever. The reservoirs flooded hardwood forests. They altered fish migration patterns. They reduced water quality in some areas. At the time, those costs were considered acceptable. Today, we know better. Any large infrastructure project has environmental consequences. We must account for them, mitigate them, and be honest about them. The next issue was centralization of power. The TVA was a federal agency. It answered to Washington, not to the people of the Tennessee Valley. Over time, it became distant. It made decisions without local input. It developed its own bureaucracy, its own culture, its own priorities. The people it was supposed to serve sometimes felt like they were serving it. That's why the Indiana Century Project is state-led and not federal. It's why we have host community fees. It's why we have local stations and county benefit agreements. We want the people who build the infrastructure to live near it. We want the people who operate it to come from the communities that it serves. The TVA worked, but it could have worked better with local control. The TVA also has a nuclear legacy. The TVA built nuclear plants too. Some of them worked, some had problems. The Browns Ferry fire in 1975 was a major nuclear accident. It damaged the reactor and cost hundreds of millions of dollars to repair. The TVA's nuclear program had safety issues, management problems, and cost overruns. We must learn from that too. That's why our Energy Corps would train to Navy nuclear standards. That's why safety culture would be the first thing that we would teach. This episode's featured book is This Changes Everything by Naomi Klein. Klein argues that climate change is not just about an environmental problem. It's an economic problem, a political problem. It's a problem of extraction versus regeneration. Forget everything you think you know about global warming. The really inconvenient truth is that it's not about carbon. It's about capitalism. The convenient truth is that we can seize this existential crisis to transform our failed economic system and build something radically better. In her most provocative book yet, Naomi Klein, author of the global bestsellers The Shock Doctrine and No Logo, tackles the most profound threat humanity has ever faced: the war our economic model is waging against life on Earth. Klein argues that climate change is not just an environmental problem. It's an economic problem. It's a political problem. It's a problem of extraction versus regeneration. Klein writes about the fossil fuel industry the same way that I write about the extraction economy. They take, they profit, they leave. They externalize the cost of pollution, health impacts, and climate disasters onto the rest of us. Then they use their wealth to block any attempt to change the system. But Klein also writes about its solutions. She writes about public power, about community-owned energy, about building systems that serve people instead of shareholders. She writes about the TVA as an example of what's possible, even as she acknowledges its failures. Her argument is that we cannot solve climate change with market mechanisms alone. We cannot shop our way to a sustainable future. We need public investment. We need public ownership. We need to build things together that we cannot build alone. That's exactly what we are planning to do in Indiana. The TVA was built to solve the crisis of its time: poverty, flood, malaria, isolation. The Indiana Century Project is built to solve the crisis of our time: extraction, decline, loneliness, and a changing climate. The scale is different, the technology is different, but the principles are the same. Part 6. The TVA Today. The TVA isn't just history. It exists today, and it is still making news. In December 2025, the Department of Energy selected TVA to receive up to $400 million in federal cost-shared funding to deploy a GE Hitachi BWRX 300 small modular reactor at the Clinch River nuclear site in Tennessee. This is not a study or a proposal. This is a construction project in progress. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission formally accepted TVA's construction permit application in July 2025 and plans to complete safety review by December 2026. TVA expects initial site work as early as 2026, with a target operation date of 2033. Here's where Indiana comes in. TVA is leading a coalition that includes Duke Energy, American Electric Power, and Indiana Michigan Power for potential deployment at the Rockport Plant in Spencer County, Indiana. The same technology TVA is building at Clinch River could come to our state. The TVA story didn't end in the 20th century. It's still being built, and Indiana is now in the room. TVA is also moving on other nuclear fronts. It has signed agreements to purchase power from Kairos Power's Hermes 2 advanced reactor and is supporting NuScale's deployment efforts. The TVA, once a cautionary tale for nuclear safety, is now an aggressive leader in advanced nuclear deployment. They learned from their mistakes. They rebuilt their safety culture. Now, they're planning on building the future. That's the lesson for Indiana. The TVA's nuclear legacy includes the Browns Ferry fire of 1975. It includes cost overruns and management problems, but the TVA did not give up. They fixed what was broken, they rebuilt, and they're still building to this day. We can do the same. We start with Navy nuclear safety culture, not TVA's old culture. We build with advanced reactors, not the troubled designs of the 1970s. But we follow the TVA's lead in one critical respect. We commit to the long term. We don't give up when things get hard. Part 7. Indiana is moving. Here's something that happened just last week. You might have missed it. On April 16th, 2026, Governor Braun and Eli Lilly CEO Dave Ricks signed a non-binding letter of intent to collaborate on nuclear energy solutions in Indiana. Small modular reactors, advanced nuclear technology, feasibility studies, site screening, grid interconnection, regulatory coordination, and workforce development. Here's what Governor Braun said. Indiana is leading on nuclear power because more energy means lower energy prices for Hoosier families. Today, I'm proud to enter into this partnership with Lilly to explore how we can collaborate on making Indiana the nation's nuclear energy leader. Here's what Eli Lilly's CEO said. For 150 years, Lilly has grown alongside Indiana. Advanced nuclear technology represents the kind of bold, clean energy solution our state needs to power the next generation of innovation, and it directly supports Lilly's own commitment to reduce our environmental footprint. We're proud to partner with the state to help make it a reality. This is no longer just about the Indiana Century Project. This is about the state of Indiana. This is about a Fortune 500 company, and it is now real. Now, I need to be honest with you. The Braun-Lilly agreement is non-binding. It is a letter of intent, not a contract. There are no nuclear facilities in Indiana with the capacity to immediately start producing energy. The timeline is unclear, and a lot of work remains to be done. But, directionally, this is everything we've been talking about. The state is partnering with private industry on nuclear. The governor is using the language we've been using. Small modular reactors, advanced nuclear, workforce, feasibility. The Indiana Century Project is not a fantasy. It's the leading edge of what is already happening. There is some good news in there, but I don't really trust politicians like Governor Braun to do the right thing for the people of Indiana. And even if he does make a deal with Lilly and get some kind of nuclear power for Indiana, it's most likely going to be owned by a private corporation. The profits might go out of state. And if it ever becomes too expensive for the company, they could just ditch it or sell it to someone else, which would leave Indiana holding the bag. If we are going to go down this road, we not only need to make sure that it's safe, but we have to make sure that it benefits the people of Indiana for generations to come. Part 8. The TVA's relevance for Indiana. Let me draw the lines from the TVA to the Indiana Century Project. First is integration, not isolation. The TVA integrated flood control, electricity, agriculture, and economic development. It understood that these problems were all connected. You couldn't solve flood control without thinking about power generation. You couldn't solve poverty without thinking about electricity. You couldn't solve soil exhaustion without thinking about fertilizer and education. The Indiana Century Project is built on the same insight. Energy, connectivity, agriculture, health, and funding are not separate issues. They are one system. A reactor powers a train carries fiber, fiber enables precision agriculture, agriculture feeds rural health clinics, clinics employ the core builds the next reactor. Second is public ownership, not private extraction. The TVA was public. It was owned by the people, operated for their benefit. Its mission wasn't to maximize shareholder value. Its mission was to transform a region. The Indiana Century Project is built for the same reason. Our reactors would be owned by the Indiana Energy and Resilience Authority. The state fiber would be state-owned. The bank would be state-owned. And the workforce would be state-employed by people across all 92 counties. The value stays in Indiana because the assets belong to Indiana. Third is patient capital. The TVA didn't have to show quarterly profits. It could invest in projects that would take decades to pay off. It could build transmission lines to poor counties because that was the mission, not because it was immediately profitable. The Bank of Indiana is built on that same principle. It would lend at 3 to 4%. It partners with community banks. It would invest in infrastructure that would take a generation to mature. That is what patient capital is. It is patient because it doesn't answer to Wall Street. And last is federal partnership, not federal control. The TVA was federal. It had advantages and disadvantages. The Indiana Century Project would be state-led, but it partners with federal agency. The Navy for nuclear training, the Department of Energy for fuel and waste, the Department of Transportation for rail grants, the USDA for agriculture. We use the government as a partner, not as a boss. Part 9. Objections and Responses. Alright, let's walk through some of the objections. Objection 1. The TVA was federal. We are talking about state-led. Yes, the scale is different. The TVA crossed state lines. The Indiana Century Project would be contained within Indiana. But the principles are the same. Public ownership for public benefit. If anything, state-led is better. We have more local control. We have fewer layers of bureaucracy. We can move faster. Objection 2. The TVA displaced thousands of families. They did. We need to learn from that. Our Infrastructure Corridors Amendment requires 125% compensation, relocation assistance, and community benefit agreements. No one loses their home or property without being made whole. We can build without repeating the mistakes of the past. Objection 3. The TVA's nuclear program was a disaster. I agree. Some parts were. The Browns Ferry fire in 1975 was a major accident. But the TVA learned. They rebuilt their safety culture. Today, they're leading the nation in advanced nuclear deployment. The lesson is not that nuclear is impossible. The lesson is that safety culture matters. That's why we train to Navy nuclear standards. Objection 4. We don't need a TVA for Indiana. The market will provide. The truth is, the market did not provide for Tennessee Valley, and it's not doing a great job for Indiana right now. Private utilities wouldn't build in the Tennessee Valley because it wasn't profitable. Private banks wouldn't lend there because the risk was too high. The same is true for rural Indiana today. The market won't build fiber to Switzerland County, won't build a hospital in Martin County, and it won't build a reactor anywhere without state support. The market is not a substitute for public action. It should be complementary. Objection 5. The Braun-Lilly deal is just talk. Nothing's actually happening. It is a letter of intent, not a contract. That's true. But letters of intent are how serious partnerships begin. They don't start with construction. They start with exploration. The fact that the governor and a major corporation are publicly aligned on nuclear is a significant step. It means that our next governor, whoever that is, inherits momentum, not just a blank page. Objection 6. The TVA was a product of the New Deal. That era is over. The era of public investment is never over. It just goes through cycles. The interstate highway system was built in the 50s and 60s. The internet was built with public funding. The rural electrification networks were built with public investment. Every generation builds what it needs, and we need to build now. Part 10. The Bridge to Indiana. The TVA transformed a region. It took the poorest part of America and lifted it into the middle class. It didn't happen overnight. It took decades. The first dams were built in the 1930s. The full system wasn't complete until the 1950s, but the people who started it didn't see the end. The same would be true for the Indiana Century Project. We wouldn't see 50 reactors for decades. We wouldn't see a complete high-speed rail network for maybe longer. We wouldn't see a future fund reach $100 billion in many of our lifetimes. But we can start it. We can build the first reactor. We can lay the first track. We can string the first fiber. We can fund the first core member. We can open the first rural clinic. The TVA took a generation to change the Tennessee Valley. The Indiana Century Project will take a generation to change Indiana. That's okay. That's how big things work. The people who built the TVA didn't know if it would succeed, but they started building it anyway. They built dams and transmission lines and fertilizer plants because they believed that the people of the Tennessee Valley deserved better. And they were right. We are the people of the TVA's generation. Not the same people, but the same kind of people. Builders, believers, people who refuse to accept that decline is inevitable. And here's the difference. The TVA had to build from scratch. We already have partners. The TVA itself is building small modular reactors in Tennessee right now, with Indiana in the coalition. Governor Braun and Eli Lilly just signed a letter of intent to explore nuclear in Indiana. First American Nuclear Company, or FANCO, a company we talked about earlier this season, has submitted its regulatory engagement plan to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. They want to build a closed fuel cycle energy park right here. We are not starting from zero. We are catching up to momentum that already exists. Part 11. Conclusion and Preview. Alright, let's take a look at where we are. The TVA was the largest public works project in American history. It transformed a region. It proved that public ownership could work. It proved that ordinary people, organized at scale, could lift themselves out of poverty. It also had failures. It displaced families. It damaged the environment. It centralized power. It struggled with nuclear safety. We learn from those failures, and we build better. But the TVA isn't just history. It's happening right now. TVA is building small modular reactors in Tennessee with $400 million from the federal government. Indiana is in this coalition now. The same technology could come to Rockport. And Indiana is moving. Governor Braun and Eli Lilly just signed a letter of intent to collaborate on nuclear energy. FANCO is pursuing regulatory approval for a closed fuel cycle reactor. The pieces are already coming together. The Indiana Century Project is our TVA, not a copy, but an adaptation. State-led instead of federal. Nuclear instead of hydro. Local ownership instead of a centralized control. Constitutional locks instead of legislative goodwill. But the same principles from the TVA apply. Integration, not isolation. Public ownership instead of private extraction. Patient capital instead of quarterly profits. We must build for the long term. Build for the people who come after us. This changes everything, teaches us that the crises we face are connected. Climate, poverty, extraction, loneliness, they are the same problem. It's the same system, the same extraction economy. The TVA was built to solve the crises of their time. The Indiana Century Project is built to solve the crises of ours. Next week, in episode 14, The Reactor in a Box, a deep dive on small modular reactor technology, how they work, why they're safe, why Indiana is the perfect place to build them. Before we get there, let's think about something. What would the Tennessee Valley look like today if the TVA had never been built? What would Indiana look like in 50 years if we built nothing? What would it look like if we built everything? That's the choice. Do we build or decline? Build or extract? Build or be left behind? I'm Corey. This is the Indiana Century Podcast. And remember, sovereignty isn't given, it is built.